Hello friends, for today's video, now that we are past the halfway point of the year, I wanted to take a look back and assess the emerging trends within the first portion of 2025. And I wanted to ensure that we were able to capture as many of these as possible. So I did offer up this to all of you and asked for your insight, your feedback, and your observations. So we'll be going through all of those. Before jumping into your responses though, I do want to start by saying there are two things that I want to make note of. One is the whole idea of AI in book spaces, as well as the fan fiction to traditionally published book pipeline. So for the AI thing, I did do a dedicated video about this, and I plan to do others in the future. I think this is a consistently shifting topic as new things are happening rapidly with this. So I went quite in depth in the past, and I will be going in depth in the future with this topic. I don't have positive things to say, spoiler alert, but that's not necessarily going to be as talked about today because we have had a dedicated video to that and we'll have dedicated videos in the future. And then the other thing that at the time I'm recording this, my guess is that this is about to be something that gets discussed a lot, and likely once this video goes up there will already be a lot of conversations about this, and that is the whole idea of things that were previously fan fiction that are now becoming traditionally published books. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about this, and I will admit I was somebody who held to some of those misconceptions and misunderstandings in the past, and I did do a whole video dedicated to that as well. This is also not going to be discussed in depth today. The main reason being, we're about to see this becoming a trend of all the releases that we're about to get. It's about to happen, so I don't feel it can fit within the idea of falling under the umbrella of first half of 2025. This is more going to be a topic, I think, for second half of the year, and I likely will do future dedicated videos to specific books that have been coming out and conversations surrounding those books, the various different viewpoints about the ethics of it all. We'll get into that, but because not all of those books are out just yet, can't really go as in-depth as I would want. So be on the lookout if that is a topic you're interested in. But on that note, let's get into your feedback about trends from the first half of 2025. As always, I like to, as a thank you to my patrons, ensure that I read through their responses, and then we will jump to the community tab, but we're going to jump into the patron responses first. So Hazel Phoenix says, trends. For the first time in a while, I haven't been tempted by many new books. I don't have any new release favorites. I'm enjoying the novels from past years on my bookshelf much more. I found myself rereading past favorites. I've wondered if some of the more popular genres have become oversaturated. Maybe publishers are simply publishing books again and again that are little more than clones of their past successes. Not that that hasn't happened before many times with other genres and stories. It's just that for some reason I'm missing the originality from past years, or this could all just be my personal experience. Looking forward to your next videos as always. Thank you. Thank you as always for participating in this. And also, I have found this to be my experience as well. I would say the last couple years, this year in particular, when I have found books that I've really fallen in love with, they have almost exclusively been backlisted. However, in the same way that you mentioned that it could just be your experience and that it has, you're sure, happened in the past before, I do want to allow for that as well. And I've actually noted that I think that in the past, it wasn't as obvious necessarily because we didn't have social media. So we've talked about before that with fantasy specifically, and this is true for other genres, but I'm going to stick to fantasy because I know most of you are fantasy readers as well. Fantasy in the past, there was a lot that was very obviously inspired by Lord of the Rings. Some of the inspirations were a little more subtle, some were glaringly obvious. Those books in and of themselves became kind of classic fantasy staples. That's how a lot of people would categorize them. And they were seen as things that influenced later fantasy works. But at the end of the day, a lot of them did find the roots of the beginnings of their stories, at the very least, in Lord of the Rings. Not trying to say that anybody was plagiarizing or anything like that, but it was obvious where inspirations lie. And I think that it wasn't maybe as talked about because there wasn't really a vehicle to do so. Nowadays, like what we're doing today, we're assessing trends, we're talking about the very thing that you're pointing out, which is that a lot of things feel similar, which is not untrue. I agree with that. A lot of things do feel similar. But I actually think fantasy, adult fantasy specifically, because we didn't really have young adult before, but adult fantasy as we know it today was kind of in that spot for a long time. Quest fantasy, the hero's journey, the boy from the rural area, the reluctant hero. We saw a lot of that for a long time. And then it started to have a shift at some point, like all genres have their pivots. And from there, we see new pivots. So I think a perfect example is something like A Court of Thorns and Roses was a big pivot in the direction of what we now have gotten to be fantasy romance. It felt like everything. This might be the first year it doesn't feel like everything that's coming out is a Fae-inspired release, but it felt like everything for so long was trying to be the next A Court of Thorns and Roses. And since we're, many of us, online or perpetually online, we're online so much, we're all seeing it, we're all talking about it, we're all pointing it out. Publishers know it. They're marketing books as this is like ACOTAR meets fill in the blank. You even have the naming structure, which didn't start, of course, with The Court of Thorns and Roses. You have A Song of Ice and Fire, for example. But you did find that there even naming conventions were starting to be matched. And the descriptions of the male love interests were similar. So you started to see it. And I think it was even more overt and more obvious because we all were like, hey, we're all noticing this, right? Whereas before, one, reading was not as popular as it is today, so there were less people reading, and it was a more isolated hobby at the time that some of those more classic fantasy works were popular. I'm not disagreeing, just to be as clear as possible. I agree that there are plenty of things that feel like we're just seeing the same old, but I also agree that it's not necessarily new and it's been done before. I don't love this trend in general, though, of finding whatever that next popular thing is and trying to replicate it. I think it's one thing to, when something comes onto the scene that is a genre bender or is very different than anything we've seen before. I like the idea that it opens the door for other things like it. I don't like, however, where you try to find things solely because that's what's hot right now. I do think that there's a difference between those things. And I think sometimes, to give publishing some credit, I think sometimes they genuinely are trying to be like, oh, okay, this has opened the door, let's try. And other times I think most of the time they're just trying to capitalize on the success. Now, as far as the personal, what I have liked, I will say I have enjoyed the backlist fantasy books that I have been picking up. I could be mistaken about this. I know this has been a talking point the last few years. It does feel like some of the quality of writing and editing is not as much of a focus these days. And for some people, they don't care as much about that. I'm not saying I need everything to read like poetry and be the most beautiful prose we've ever seen. But some of it, I'm not a fan of. Sometimes I wish there was more time to cook. I wish sometimes things had more time to bake. That we just worked on getting them to be the best versions they could be, and we didn't need everything to come out back to back to back, which is why I'm always perpetually patient when it comes to new releases. I know for some people, if they have to wait 2 years, they're like, that's ridiculous, and I'm like, no, I think that view is ridiculous. It takes so long and so much effort to write a book, and oftentimes these people are on incredible deadlines, because it's not like they had that full time to write it. A lot of times they had far less time because then it has to go through editing, and then you got to do when's it going to come out, and you got to do the marketing, and there's so much that goes into it. So you're asking people to write books in a very short amount of time and often on a very small amount of money, a very small advance. So a fair amount of people are still working their full-time day jobs. Point is, I think sometimes the reason that I'm picking up books and finding the older ones are working for me more than the newer ones is because it feels like the new ones are not going through everything traditional publishing has to offer. It feels like some of the newer works aren't going through all of what they have to offer as much as the publishers should have them go through. And so they just kind of come out feeling fine. I like the stories, I like the concepts, I like the characters well enough, but it feels like it's not quite as tight as it could be at times, or maybe the opposite, where it feels like we could have had things linger more, we could have fleshed things out more. And sometimes the older works I'm picking up, I'm not feeling that. I feel like there was more time to really put out the best version of something as possible, which I know sounds really negative, but I'm trying to determine, is this a chicken or egg situation? Is it that we're all accepting a lower quality, and thus publishing's like, well, if they're accepting it, then we don't need to put as much into it and we can churn out books more? Or is it that publishing is churning out stuff and we're just like I guess this is what we have here now. I'm not really sure who is to blame. It's probably blame all around, but I wish things felt a little more polished. As far as originality, it feels like publishing is starting to hyperfixate on the demographic of who the book is meant for. You want to ensure that people are well represented, and that if you're telling a story about a person who maybe is neurodivergent, you want to make sure that people who are picking up the book feel really seen by the representation and that it's done really well. And so I think it's good to consider, like, who's this for? And also for the people that it's not quote unquote for, are we representing people in a way where we are bridging gaps and we're allowing for people to gain more empathy and we're showing different life experiences, all those sorts of things. In the case of gender, as an example, I think we're starting to get things where it's like, this is for women, and thus we're gonna, to put it bluntly and in a like internet lingo kind of way, we're gonna have these books be for the female gaze, and then these books are for the male gaze. And I'm like, can we just write characters as people? Can we write plot lines that a lot of people can understand? And even if they haven't experienced it themselves, as I was saying before, they can see that and then they can gain empathy for another group or understanding about another group, and we can bridge the gap a little more. And I think we as readers, once again, taking some accountability, we can be better about not seeing things as just for men or just for women or just for any like one specific group. We should be wanting to read broadly. We shouldn't just be like, well, this is what I like based off of random arbitrary details of who I am, because that's, I don't like approaching books like that in general. But I think that is where we're seeing a lack of originality, because we're trying so hard to pigeonhole something into a specific money-making demographic, and I think that is part of the problem. And when I talk about there being this like, we had this moment, it felt like anyway, maybe I'm just being like old and like back in my day, but it felt like there was this moment where anything was possible, and that I felt like we were all coming together, and that fantasy was starting to feel like this universal thing so many of us could like. And now it feels like a lot of finger pointing about like the things you like versus the things I like. Moving on, the next one says, there seems to be a small resurgence of mermaids. The sirens upon a starlit tide, when the tides held the moon, the woman and the waves, a magic deep and drowning. And it's a stretch, but Sirens on Netflix, being a reimagining of sorts and referenced throughout in a modern, non-magical setting, also in the veins of The Drowning. Most of these were published and released within a few months of each other. So I don't know if I had noticed it, because I've only read one of those many works that were listed, and that's why I think it's so great to ask all of you this, because I would not have been able to assess that this was a trend. But that is a lot of more sea mythological creatures and beings related things. That's a lot all at once, and I think you're right. It definitely seems like there's something to it. I wonder why. I know we're coming away from Fae, but I'm trying to figure out why there's such a surge here, because it maybe if I were to kind of look across different types of stories, I'd be like, well, there was the new Little Mermaid that came out not that long ago, but I would have thought it would have been closer. So I'm not really sure what's caused that. Yeah, I don't know. I like to try to usually find it, but this one I don't know if I can pinpoint specifically. You didn't mention it, and it's not exactly mermaid related, but as far as underwater things, even A Forgery of Fate fits this, because you're looking at this underwater dragon kingdom. There already was references to this kingdom, so I'm not trying to say that Elizabeth Lim hopped on some kind of trend or anything like that, but there are a lot of underwater things. There's also, once again, you mentioned specifically mermaid related things. But as far as underwater things, there's the Letters to the Luminous Deep. That was another underwater thing. Perhaps we're just bored of things that transpire on land. We're like, anything but here, but also not space. Space is spooky. Next up, Z says, I'm seeing a new trend coming up, the Lady Night books, and honestly, I'm totally here for it. A few titles already came out, The Night and the Moth, The Starving Saints, but most of them are yet to be released. The Everlasting and The Isle in the Silver Sea, The Princess Knight. And then Daphne responded and said, kind of related to this, I've been seeing more religious imagery and settings as well. Many of the books you mentioned seem to have that aspect. I think The Devils does as well. Yeah, The Devils definitely. I absolutely agree. The Devils definitely has a lot of religious symbolism and just very overt commentary on religion. I have read The Night and the Moth, and then I have read The Isle in the Silver Sea. I can't talk about that one just yet because it's not out yet, and I read an arc. But I agree that there are some books coming out that have this factor to them. A few years ago, Vespertine came out by Margaret Rogerson, and that kind of fit in this, but it wasn't really, I would say, a trend at that point. It does feel like it's potentially the beginnings of a new trend. And maybe what's tying together the first comment about a lot of things feel like there's a lack of originality, perhaps what this and the previous comments are noting is that we are potentially right on the cusp of a shift. And that's exciting, because I was talking about before how there's a lot of things that were trying to be ACOTAR. And then I think things weren't necessarily trying to be ACOTAR. I think then things were starting to try to be fourth wing. And I think a lot of fantasy romance, because it's so new, in the same way that I described so many books in classic fantasy feeling like they had, at the very least, dipped their toes in the well that was inspiration from Tolkien. It feels like a lot of people were doing that same thing for, I would say, fourth wing, and just in general, specific fantasy romance tropes. And since it was new, it was like kind of trying to find its footing. Now that it's more established, perhaps we have the opportunity to branch out a little bit more. And it's almost like something can't branch out until it's formed its roots. And its roots feel kind of trapped in a certain spot, but then we can branch out into new things. And so maybe that's what we're right about to do. Because I agree with both of these things, that it's like, okay, we are seeing a little bit more with mermaids. We're seeing a little bit more with lady knights. And before it was like fae, lots of enemies to lovers. Those were the two things. So the fact that we're seeing two what feel like pretty prominent examples of something that feels trendy right now, I also think a lot of us were noting it feels like there's more vampire stuff. So it's starting to feel like it's opening back up. So maybe what I was worried about before of feeling like there's this divide, maybe we're bridging that divide a little bit, which would be lovely. I hope that's what's happening. Getting to the community tab now. First up, it says, I love that I've been seeing a lot more booktubers picking up and reading indie and self-published fantasy and sci-fi books. There are so many amazing writers who don't get enough spotlight because they didn't go traditionally published. I also love this. This makes me very happy. And I think that for a lot of the conversations about the idea of what's happened to fantasy, we're getting the same old, I actually think if you want something that feels different, there are a number of things I've read that I think are fantastic that are self-published. In fact, some of my favorite books that I've picked up this year, I would point to indie and self-pub rather than traditional publishing. And I think it's because of the very things that we've been mentioning already, is that I think traditional publishing exists within a very obvious money-making machine, and thus they try to release things in times where it would make the most sense, and they do care about trends, of course, whereas I think self-published authors, they have a specific vision, they have a story they want to tell, and they're going to do it on their own time, and if it's years after when something was popular, okay. If it's like nothing else that exists, okay. If it does feel like it's giving homage to the classics, okay. These are just the stories they want to tell. Nobody's trying to force them into writing a story that fits something different. A lot of people are pouring so much time and effort into their works because they care. They care about their stories and they want them to be as much as possible on equal footing with the things that have come out. And I actually feel like some of the traditionally published books I've picked up, I don't even know if I can say I think that the books in the literal writing of them, the prose, I don't even know if some of them are as strong. Of course, you run the risk of potentially there being more typos and such things, maybe something with the physical copies because there's such a limited amount of options for self-pub, but as far as the stories and some of the writing itself, I think a lot of self-pub and indie authors are doing an amazing job. Next up, I'm glad more people are calling out books that seem to be written by AI, or even the ones where they were self-pub and left the AI prompt in the book. AI should have zero access to creative spaces. Agree. And then somebody responded, said, 100% agree. I was shocked to see authors leaving AI prompts in their books. I wish AI would just die out. It's everywhere. I also wish it would die out. I am astounded that anybody would do that and that anybody would try to justify it. From what I understand, one person tried to justify it by being like, I'm busy. And I'm like, yeah, duh, we all are. That's not a good excuse. Taking shortcuts. And also your whole idea, the same way with AI art, it's still theft. When you use AI prompts for creative writing, especially when you ask it to write something in the style of someone else, that is not you. You did not individually do that. I don't know why you can even feel okay if you haven't come up with the story yourself. If you didn't even come up with having the story that's in your head come out in a way that is organic to your voice, then it's not yours. It's not yours. And it's also not worth telling because you didn't have anything to say. You just wanted, you had the rumblings of a story in your head, and then you decided you are so entitled that you deserve to cheat your way through. And you're not ever going to put out anything of quality. You're not, because you are always going to be, you are in the very nature of using AI to write in the style of someone else, or you've presented a prompt, you are plagiarizing. That is what it is. It's theft because it's developed off of other people's work. Can you imagine if somebody sang and then they recorded it and they're like, okay, but make me sound like Ariana Grande, and then they released an album where it's not even their voice. They just were like, oh, make me sound like her, and then let's pretend that that's me. It's like, it's not you. You're never going to be able to deliver anything beyond that, and you also didn't do any of the work, so you're never going to improve. You're never going to actually know what you're doing. It's so, I can't believe anybody would justify it. I really can't. It doesn't make any sense. It's like nobody has any integrity at all. And I think there are so many people that want credit for the idea. If you have a good idea, find an author, friend of yours, I don't know, commission an actual writer and be like, I have this great idea. And sometimes that's a thing. As an example, sometimes there are certain stories, like a manga, where the story is from someone and then the art is from someone else. That's obviously more common in comic books, but a lot of times in manga, the person who creates the story and the person who does all the art, it's the same person, which is incredible. And with comic books, a lot of times one person has the story and then another person does the art, because sometimes somebody is the creative ideas and somebody else has the ability to make those creative ideas come to life, and that's okay, but go that route. Don't go AI. You didn't do... I don't understand why we're all so lazy. I understand some people are tired, and I understand that some people's... I like how I started by being like, AI, we already did a video about AI, but I blame you, person who commented. What was your name? What was your username? It's all your fault. If you mention AI, I'm gonna... Meg Sprites. Meg, it's all your fault. But I feel like there are a lot of people who are really, really tired, and they have jobs that force them to use AI in some fashion, and that's obviously not the same thing. I'm not trying to ask everybody to quit their jobs and have no means of paying their bills. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to not engage in intellectual plagiarism and theft for your own hobby that you will never be good at and that you will never amount to anything with, because you are not willing to put in any time or any effort. I just have no respect. I have no respect. And it just speaks to the entitlement of people being like, but I want this and I think I deserve it. Even though I haven't done anything for it, I still think I deserve it. Okay, we're gonna move on now. Meg. Garfield's Lasagna says, I love the trend of men in fantasy not all being that fantasy man. You know, 6'5", black hair, tanned, ripped. We want variety. And then somebody replied, 1,000,000,000%. That trend was getting... They meant so annoying. I agree that we are starting to see a variety in how the fellas are looking. And in general, I think we want variety all around. We want people from different backgrounds, people that look different, people who have different capabilities. I just think in general we want different kinds of characters and stories. Next up, I've been seeing a lot of booktubers I follow going back to the roots of reading and reviewing content they've loved a lot in the past or still love but don't talk about as much because they've been chasing trends. It's refreshing to see the genuine passion come back rather than just posting what they hope will get lots of views. I really don't like the performative book buying bans that last 2 seconds, or reading down your TBR but it's actually not going down. I will say, I think that I try to give some benefit of the doubt. I think sometimes it is performative. I think other times it is an attempt to hold themselves accountable by declaring it to other people that they're going to go on a book buying ban, and if I speak it out into the world, then there's a higher chance that I'll feel shame if I don't follow through with this. And then they inevitably buy something and they're like, oh, whoops. And I can understand that scenario. They're trying to be transparent about, and like I said, they're trying to hold themselves accountable by being like, okay, I'm not going to buy any more books for this amount of time or until this or that. And then when they don't succeed, they want to be transparent about that also. And sometimes it's just kind of sad. As far as the people talking about what they want to talk about, talking about things that they really enjoy, I really am happy about this too. I think for me, from my observations anyway, of course I don't see all the same things that everybody else is seeing, but from my observations and even just talking to fellow booktubers who are friends of mine, I think a lot of people are genuine, and I think a lot of people, if they talk about something that's popular, it's because they have a genuine interest, and maybe they get on the hype train. And then sometimes, at some point, they're like, I'm a little bored of everything that's new. I kind of want to go back and try others. I think it's like a natural progression that they're feeling, and then other people are feeling as well. I think most people are very genuine. It's not like you're making the money and getting the views for the most part if you are making content around books. It's just not. Even as popular as books are nowadays in comparison to how it used to be, I would say booktube is still not exactly the outlet for making lots of money and getting lots of followers or anything like that. However, there are exceptions. And it's up to somebody to decide for themselves if they think that a person is only talking about things to make money and get views, or if it feels like they just happen to always like the things that make money and get views. I think it's I would always err on the side of giving people some grace and assuming that they are genuine, or maybe they have a cool idea and it is related to a trend, but they're not doing it because they just want to always chase views. They're doing it because they're creative and their mind works in interesting ways, and it could be a fun project and can also provide commentary on things as they are happening now. I think for the most part, I err on that side of, I think most people are genuine. There are exceptions though. Now, as far as the genuine people who maybe incidentally got swept up in hype or incidentally got swept up in what was popular, I think it's great for people to have honest conversations about that. This is a conversation for a different day, but the whole idea of buying books, not buying books, and it relates to the thing you were mentioning about book buying bans, I think that there is certainly nuance to the topic of using your library versus going to indie bookstores versus buying things new. There's a lot of nuance with that topic that gets lost, unfortunately, in trying to have a hot take about either side of that equation. But I think what is something I appreciate is that some people, they do kind of get swept up a little bit in the consumerism side of things. And then they reflect and they're like, yeah, I kind of went wild with the buying of books when I first joined. And then I'm taking a step back and I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I need this, or I don't know if I need that edition. And they're assessing and they're having some self-reflection. And I think that's good and that's honest. And that is an important thing for us to continually want and continually strive for. Next up, books, beverages, and besties. That's such a cute username. I'm starting to see more and more discussions, especially post-Silver Elite, on anti-intellectualism and an emphasis on critical thinking instead of, quote, turn your brain off and it's a 5-star mentality. Fluff has its place, but it's nice to see, at least in my corner, discussions on how it's not always appropriate with certain content to, quote, turn your brain off. And Meg's back. I'm teasing. I hope you know I'm not actually upset. I appreciate your commentary. Meg said, oh yes, this is so true. So I'm really hesitant to use the term anti-intellectualism because it's just such a broad generalization. I am interested in having conversations rooted in these concepts, but I avoid that phrase because it's just, I find such a quick way to shut down a conversation when you accuse people in engaging in anti-intellectualism, in the same way that the opposite can be true. If somebody genuinely really likes something that's a little quote-unquote highbrow and someone's like, well, you're just pretentious, and you're like, okay, can we just maybe hear somebody out? If you hear them out and you're like, and you still think like, oh, they seem a little pretentious, that's fine. If you hear somebody out and you're like, kind of seems like they just don't feel like thinking right now, you can decide that for yourself, you know. But I think coming back around to the chicken or the egg, is it that we all are fine with the quality of writing maybe not being as high, or is it that publishing is like, who cares, let's just put it out and the plebeians will have to accept it? Which one is it? I think that is where a lot of the anti-intellectualism comes from, because then sometimes, even if the quality of the writing isn't as high, or maybe the plot lines aren't as deep, people still find enjoyment from these things. And then they feel really bad because they'll see somebody being like, this is for people who just don't even want to use their brains and they don't even want to think. And I want to think. If you don't want to think, that's fine. And if that's the impression, it's like, that doesn't really feel like an opportunity to have a conversation, you know? So I do find that this is an area where everybody just seems to be accusing everybody else of either being really stupid or being really high on their own fumes, we'll say. But the core of what you're talking about, this idea that some books are going to contain content that is in some fashion potentially harmful, or it is perpetuating stereotypes that are very negative in nature. And if somebody dismisses any conversation about those things as just let me enjoy what I enjoy, it's like, okay, nobody's saying you can't enjoy it. You can if you want, but it also is okay for somebody to want to have a conversation about those things. And I feel like the mature thing to do is, let's say you liked something, you didn't even notice. Let's say it's that. You didn't even notice that maybe there was something in it that somebody is saying like, hey, this actually might be kind of not the greatest. And you notice it and you're like, oh, dang, that's true. And you can very easily go, I did like it, but I do agree. You're right. I didn't even think of that. But that's true. That is true. I think that's a mature way to approach something. I think an immature way to approach something is if you hear that and you somehow take it as a personal attack when it wasn't, because there are times where people will be aggressive and they'll just basically be like, if you didn't notice, it's because, and then they'll kind of go on the offensive out of nowhere. But if somebody's not and they're just pointing out, here's why this book I found to be fill in the blank, and someone's like, how dare you, I liked it, that is very juvenile, because we're all gonna get different things out of books. We all have different experiences, and so somebody might be, I think it's great, it's very enlightening when somebody's willing to share why something for them didn't work, and when they're willing to have at times hard conversations or vulnerable conversations about something. And I think there are times where somebody can respectfully disagree also, and maybe they even come from a similar background. They're like, here's why I actually liked that thing. And I just think there's a way to have a conversation with each other where you're not just right out the gate acting like, if you like this, it's because you're dumb. And then the reverse of, if you're telling people your own opinions about the work itself, but their opinions I don't agree with, then how dare you? I just think it's immaturity. It's just a lot of people, I think, not recognizing when conversations about books are not necessarily inherently attacks on an individual who has read that book. I will add, though, I don't know if I understand the idea of turning your brain off and then it's a 5-star. Because for me, there's a difference between something is so fun and that is, it feels like its purpose is to just have a good time. It's really, really fun. And if that's the point, there is a way to do that is still masterful and difficult to craft and artistic. And then there are times where something kind of sucks, but you're like, well, if I just don't think about it, then it doesn't. And you're like, that doesn't really make any sense. Because, okay, not everybody's gonna have liked it, and that's fine. My friends make fun of me. I don't like a fair amount of movies, but I will say, and I think everybody thinks that I'm like a movie snob, and I'm like, I don't think I'm a movie snob. I think I'm open about how I feel about a lot of movies, and I just happen to not think some movies are very good. But a movie that I watched recently that was just, in my opinion, pure fun, it was such a good time, was K-pop Demon Hunters. It is so fun. I didn't think it was fun because I turned my brain off. I genuinely thought that some of the things that they put into it were really well done. I thought it was a really well done, fun story. Same with comedies. Like, some comedies, just because you I'm sure we've all seen this before, where somebody will say something that's just rude, and then someone will be like, that's not funny, and they're like, oh, you just can't take a joke. And you're like, but the joke has to be funny. Or you have to try. It wasn't clever. And it wasn't so stupid it was funny. It was just rude. Just because you... And you just get exhausted by people being like, you just don't have a sense of humor. So, to me, it's like the same thing. Just because something's fun or just because something's funny doesn't mean that there wasn't artistry behind that, and that there's not a skill to develop the ability to have something be fun and that be the general takeaway. So I don't get it. I don't get the whole, like, it was good because I didn't think at all. I love the focus on libraries and supporting them. Aw, me too. And also, I love that your username is Boo Reads and you're, a cute little ghost. Your ghost is very cute. Anyway, yes, libraries are great. And I think that, I don't know if I necessarily think this is a trend of 2025. I think that this is something a lot of people have been doing, but perhaps people are being more vocal about it, because I think sometimes from the outside looking in, because a lot of people who talk about books online have a lot of books, that there's this view that none of us use the library or go to indie bookstores. So I think maybe some people are trying to be a little bit more open about, like, oh yeah, I love the library. So maybe it's partially that, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a lot of people just genuinely are like, I never walked into a library before today. Next up, somebody said, I don't like the trend. It's a fantasy written by a woman and there is a light romance plot. Let's list it as romantasy. There's a reply that said, oh, I hate that so much. Someone else said, yeah, there's already a very prevalent trend of labeling every fantasy book written by a woman and with a female main character as YA. Even though it doesn't fit the book at all, the story could be very complex. There could be explicit scenes, genocide, assault, but publishing companies and marketers will still label it YA, even though they would never do that if the book literally had the same content but was written by a man and with just a male protagonist. I feel like this is just the same type of trend where you try to limit and push every type of fantasy book written by a woman into the same narrow box. And then someone said, Garfield's Lasagna, they said, I heard someone call a Leigh Bardugo book a romantasy. It was Ninth House. I'm still furious. Yeah, Ninth House is not romantasy, even a little bit. I also am with you. That's infuriating. It was worded really well, this idea that we have to, it feels like some authors or groups of authors, we have to try and put them in boxes, and as though they can only write books or represent something that can't deviate from anything there. They don't have the freedom to be as flexible in what they're writing. I will say the idea of publishing them as YA, that I think has gone down significantly. So that's good, but it's like now we're trying to find a different box for them. And I remember one time when V.E. Schwab, so if you don't know, V.E. Schwab used to be published as V.E. Schwab for her adult works and Victoria Schwab as her young adult works, because she was advised to use an abbreviated version of her name, her initials, in the adult works, because at the time that she was kind of more so becoming popular, from what they had assessed, there was still a higher likelihood of people picking up her books if they didn't know that she was a woman by just having Victoria overtly on the covers. So they had her use her initials, but for YA, the assessment was this isn't as much of a problem based off of our data, so you can use it there. And then when she had a book coming out, that it was very confusing, because it was seeming like she was going to be V.E. Schwab, but then people thought, this sounds YA. Oh, but she only uses V.E. Schwab for the adult work, so it must be adult. So she clarified, actually, this particular book, Gallant was the book, I'm pretty sure. She had a post where she was saying, explaining this, in the past, my publisher advised me to use my initials for the adult works and my name, my full name, for the YA. However, I just want to be V.E. Schwab across the board. I don't want to differentiate anymore, so I'm just going to be V.E. Schwab, and Gallant is young adult. So because there was some lack of understanding, when she posted that and cleared it up, I had taken a screenshot and I shared it to my community tab. And I was like, oh, for anybody, because I had mentioned it in an anticipated release this video, and there was a lot of back and forth about if it was YA or if it wasn't. So I just posted that just to be like, oh, there's the answer, she said herself. And then there were comments that were one saying, that never happens, nobody doesn't pick up a book because it's a woman. So there were people that were saying like, nuh-uh. And then there was another comment, and I think they were back to back. There was a comment that's like, well, I don't want to pick up her books because she only writes about girly things. And I was like, You two need to see each other's comments. Point is, though, we're now seeing authors who previously wouldn't have been considered fantasy romance or romantasy. We're seeing them shelved as that simply for the most basic of romantic plot lines. Ninth House is a weird one, though, because I'm like, I mean, I don't even feel like that one makes any sense. And then the other side of this is that there are plenty of times where stories written by men have romantic subplots, because it's a pretty common thing to have people, a lot of people, I don't know if you know this, they fall in love with people, or they are attracted to other people. So it makes sense that that's in books. And for some reason, I think a great example is Mistborn. The first Mistborn book has a romantic subplot in it. I don't know if I see Mistborn considered romantasy. There's a difference between fantasy romance and romantasy. I never see Mistborn considered romantasy. But I wonder if it was written by, what's the name that people give him sometimes as a joke instead of Brandon Sanderson? It's like Brenda something, or I can't remember. There's a whole like joke thing where they change the name and they like jokingly change the covers and stuff. But yeah, I don't, I feel like if it was Brenda Sanderson, perhaps it would be considered romantasy these days. I also want to note, just because I mentioned Mistborn, which one is it? Is it the French edition? There is one edition of Mistborn that's so funny, because I guess it's Vin, I don't know, but there's a woman on the cover who has this, she might even have what almost looks like a romance cover style of dress with the sleeves that like drape off the shoulders, which can be pretty, but isn't really Mistborn. But anyway, the sleeves are like this, and she looks very womanly, and I think the person behind her is supposed to be Kelsier. If I can find it, I'm going to share it on the screen. Maybe if it had that cover, it would be quicker to be shelved as romantasy. But anyway, now for the last comment for today. Poorly done enemies to lovers. No, I will not elaborate. I am sure there are many examples others already know about, with a smiley face. Thank you, anonymous name 5860 for the sass. Garfield's lasagna in all caps. Yes, if they don't detest each other to the bone, I don't want to hear it. Jude and Carden or nothing. And then one person said, damn, I missed that series. Maybe I should go reread The Cruel Prince. It's been so long. I have gone on and on and on in many a video about the enemies to lovers that isn't really enemies to lovers. I went on a whole meltdown rant in my, I think it was my unpopular opinions that I did recently. So I'll have that linked. But I will succinctly say, I agree. That will be how I tell you my thoughts on that. I agree. And I will say, I think we're starting to come out of that one. I think it's been a trend. I think we're seeing the end of this trend, because so many of us have complained about this. Or maybe it's just run its course. It has nothing to do with our feedback. I don't know. But anyway, that's it for some trends from the first half of the year. And I don't know if looking forward to is the right way to put it, but I will be looking out for some of the things that were touched on here and some things that I think are going to be more prevalent moving forward. And I'm also interested to see what pops up that none of us were expecting. I think those are always the trends that are the most fun to sit back and assess and analyze. But if there are trends that we didn't touch on today that you want to mention, that you noticed in the first half of the year, feel free to do so. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.